Hey there, students. This is your Professor O'Millianchuk, and today we're going to finish up our second part in a two-part series on science and religion. Okay, and we're going to look more specifically today at whether or not ID should be taught in the public schools. Now, before we jump into the ins and outs of that question, the case for and against, let's at least kind of get this on the board here. Let's warm up and just, I want you to think about this following claim. It's made by Richard Dawkins, a zoologist at Oxford University, and he says it is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. Okay, so I realize that's a pretty inflammatory statement. Richard Dawkins is known to make those. And this might not be the best question to ask. Is this true? Putting aside maybe some of these meaner options here, let's at least focus on the word ignorance, okay? And so, here's the big question really that's going to frame at least an answer to how you might address this question, right? Can someone be, an intellectually responsible, reasonable person, right, who respects science and still have doubts about evolution? Okay, or is that person just ignorant, and maybe they're not ignorant through their own fault, or they're just something has gone wrong. Okay, I mean let's try to be as charitable as possible here. What do you think, right? Is it just, hey, look, you just don't get it, okay? And this is why this is important, right? This is why I bring this up, is that if you don't believe in evolution and that entails just ignorance, then you shouldn't be teaching, right, stuff in the public schools, right? You should probably go back to biology class and learn what you need to teach in order to be a competent teacher. But if you can be reasonable and you can be respectable, right, and all these kinds of things, and you can have doubts about evolution and might embrace an alternative hypothesis, well, then the answer to this question might be a little more credible. It might be a little more positive, right? So that's kind of why I'm getting at this, right? So I want you to consider that question, okay? Let's highlight that. Okay, let's talk about the legal background a bit. All right, so this has been, what's taught in the science curriculum has been a contentious issue in the United States, right? So the first big case that you really should understand that kind of frames a lot of this is the fundamentalist controversy that came to a height in what's called the Scopes monkey trial in 1995, Dayton, Tennessee. You can Google this and look it up and read all about it. It's quite a circus. It's hard to even kind of summarize the story adequately, so I won't. But basically here, there's a law against teaching evolution, and the ACLU finds a substitute teacher who doesn't even remember if he taught it or not, to test the law, and the prosecution just gets embarrassed, okay? The law isn't overturned, believe it or not, but the whole case, the whole justification for the law against evolution is just found to be quite silly, all right? And so people who are interested in defending the Genesis account of the Bible as being kind of the literal truth of creation, they just get embarrassed. Believe it or not, though, what ends up happening finally in 1968, right, even after Eisenhower's big push to fund the STEM fields, is that the Supreme Court has to intervene and invalidate Arkansas's law that prohibits teaching of evolution, right? So even all the way up to 1968, I mean, this is well after 100 years after Darwin's book on the origin of the species is written. I mean, it's still not legal in Arkansas, at least, to learn about evolution in the public school. Arkansas seems to be where it's at. Okay, and so you can check this out here. This is a famous case, right? 1982, federal court strikes down a kind of balanced treatment law that would provide equal time for the teaching of creation science alongside evolution science. Right now, you have to understand what creation science is. that is a view that seeks to reconcile the creation account in Genesis, no matter how it's interpreted. So there's two different ways, right? You can interpret Genesis. You might think that it implies a very young Earth and universe, about 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and then you appeal to things like flood geology to try to make sense of the world around us, and you're trying to reconcile, right, basically modern science with the Genesis account. Okay, and that's going to be taught against evolution science, which of course is just what we teach today in high school and college and throughout the world. Right, and so that was the idea. Okay, and the ruling gave a detailed argument that creation science is not science. Okay, so big case. You can read about all these cases here actually at this interesting little link from the National Center of Science Education. If you're interested in this, they list 10 of them I think are really important, so you can check those out. But by far the most important one is Kitzmiller versus Dover. This is the most recent one too. This was in 2005. I actually remembered this pretty vividly. I followed it closely. And this was a case where a federal court restrained a school board from implementing a policy that would make students aware of gaps and problems in Darwin's theory, right? And referred them to a book favorable to intelligent design theory in the school library. So it wasn't an equal time policy. It wasn't asking biology teachers to do anything. Basically, what would happen is like the principal or superintendent or whoever it was, some school official would come into the biology room on the day that the evolution was to be taught, and the students were to be made aware of gaps and problems in this book in the library about intelligent design. Right, and so that was restrained, and the court opinion gave a very long and detailed argument for why intelligent design is not science. Okay. All right, so basically, here's the thing, right? If you don't want this stuff taught in the science classroom, then you have to give an argument for why it's not science, or at least that's the assumption. Okay, that's how the legal case has been made against it. And also, too, I should also point out, if you're interested in the Kitzmiller case, there's a Nova episode that tells the whole story here. It's called Judgment Day: Intelligent Design on Trial. So you can check that out. Right? I think you can find that all over the web, and you can kind of get the whole story. All right. So, but just to kind of to give you some takeaways about what's going on in the legal case. Right, the legal setting moves from one that would not allow evolution to be taught as an alternative to design, to one where design cannot be taught as an alternative to evolution. All right, now a couple things about this. All right, is that you have to understand that evolution and the evolution hypothesis and the design hypothesis, that's how I'm going to use, that's the language I'm going to use, are competing ones, and that's borne out in the history of these topics. Okay, so if you think about before Darwin, there was this observation, okay, that animals seem to be very much adapted to their environment. It looks like they're designed, right? It really does. And there was a famous natural theologian named William Paley, right, who wrote this kind of about this stuff, right? He has a book, and it's all about how the adaptation and the features of animals point to them being designed for it. Okay, that's the idea. And then Darwin comes along and says, hey, you know what, there's a problem here though. Okay, there's a lot of species that have gone extinct. Okay, and so they have not been adapted to their environment. So what's the deal here? So if you would think if there's a designer out there, we wouldn't get extinct species, right? Because the designer would outfit them with the features to adapt them to their environment. And so, of course, Darwin famously argued that what's actually happening here is that the design is just a parent. Okay, it's not made by an agent like God or anything like that. Rather, nature's doing the work here because there are features that adapt certain creatures to their environment, and then by way of natural selection, right, the ones that aren't adapted get weeded out, right? And so that's how we get the variation that we have in nature, right? So the design is imperative, right? So what's interesting here, okay, is at least now, right, one alternative hypothesis wasn't allowed to be taught, and now we've kind of moved to a place where the other alternative hypothesis is not allowed to be taught, right? And another thing to notice too is that we move from talk about creation, right, and scientific creation to intelligent design. There's a shift in language there, and that's deliberate, all right? The creationists don't want to get in trouble with the law anymore, trying to push like an interpretation of the Bible and teaching children that there's a real scientific view out there that accepts the authority of the Bible. Okay, they don't want to get into that because you're gonna run into the establishment clause of the Constitution. So we kind of go back to the idea that Paley originally had, and we're going to talk about design and intelligent design and shift that language, right? And try to get back to this idea of inferring a design hypothesis, right, from features of the natural world. All right, so it's a little more modest, okay? And also the creationists and intelligent design theorists, they ended up turning to Enlightenment principles of liberal democracy to make their case, right? Freedom of inquiry. So this is a big issue that comes up in this, right? Is that it seems like something illiberal is happening, right? So there was something illiberal happening here in these cases, right? You couldn't teach evolution. That seems pretty dumb. Okay, maybe we should, let people be free to teach it. But why can't people be free to teach it down here? Right, so that's a question that gets raised in this, right? And so there might be reasons for that, okay? Maybe there just aren't good reasons to be doing this kind of things. Maybe there's a limit to your freedom of inquiry, and doing that in the high school biology room is not a place to do that. Maybe you can do that as a graduate student, okay, or as an independent researcher. But when it comes to learning stuff in biology, people got to pass their standardized tests here, and so let's not fool around with this. Also, too, the Kitzmiller case has largely settled legal questions. Right, you don't find these cropping up in court cases around the country anymore. However, the philosophical questions still persist. Right, we explored some of those in the last lecture about methodological naturalism. Right, and some administrators still do advance the permissibility of teaching ID as an alternative, right? And so you can follow this source here. This is an LA Times article that gives you kind of a current event snapshot of the issues that are going on. This was written last year, 2018. All right, so but you can read about it, right? And I think there was a survey here. About 60% of the surveyed teachers reported that they downplayed evolution, covering it incompletely or ignoring it altogether. Okay, so it's still a big, deal. Right, so even though the legal questions may have been settled for now, how to approach your classroom is still a pretty big issue. Right, so if some of you want to be science teachers and biology teachers, you might want to think about this a little bit. Okay, so let's get into the case for teaching ID here. What I mean by teaching is kind of a broad term here. I don't mean necessarily advocating for it. I mean, just kind of mentioning it, talking about the design hypothesis. What is it they're trying to say? Okay, what's why are people motivated by this? Okay, and the paper that I had you read by was in favor of this was a guy named Thomas Nagel, and Nagel is a very interesting person. He is a famous and, well, at one time, a very highly respected philosopher. He's gotten himself into trouble, and I'll explain why. It has to do with this subject. But he teaches at NYU, and he's had many, many significant contributions to the field of philosophy many times over. I mean, he's a highly, highly respected philosopher, and he's also an ardent atheist, right? Which is kind of interesting because you would think that atheists would be kind of against this sort of policy. And one of the things he's known for is kind of his intellectual honesty. And so I wanted to just really point you to this quote here that comes out of one of his writings. And he says this. He says that I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. I want atheism to be true, and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent, well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right? It's also the hope it's that I hope there is no God, right? I don't want there to be a God, and I don't want the universe to be like that, right? Right, so my guess is that this cosmic authority problem is not a rare condition, and it's responsible for much of the scientism and reductionism of our time. And one of the tendencies it supports is this ludicrous overuse of evolutionary biology to explain everything about human life, including everything about the human mind. Right, so Nagel is an interesting person. He's kind of a classicalist. He's kind of a humanist, right? And he does not like these things. He doesn't like how science has been used to kind of reduce what's important in life, especially like our mental content, to just mere evolutionary forces, right? He finds this just deeply ridiculous, right? And so he thinks it's motivated by not just kind of a reasonable assessment of the evidence, right, against like God's existence. Rather, it's just like, no, I just don't want God to exist. I don't want that sort of authority over my life. And so this is kind of where he's coming from, right? And he just doesn't think that kind of emotional motivation is legitimate, right? That's where he's coming from. Okay, so this is why he's kind of an interesting person. All right. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what the intelligent design hypothesis is. All right, we've mentioned it a lot. I'm thinking that you're all familiar with evolution, so I'm just going to assume that, but you may not be familiar with this. And so this is what the hypothesis really says, okay, is that some features of the universe or living things are best explained by an intelligent cause, and not causes that have to do with undirected chance or natural laws. All right, so the undirected piece is kind of important here. I should probably put that in there. And so, all right, that doesn't screw up my typesetting. Good, right? And here's the thing, right? Now, ID advocates kind of get themselves in trouble sometimes. They say, well, our scientific research program doesn't make any judgments about the nature of the designer or the intelligent cause, right? It could be aliens, it could be some, cosmic force, right? Some vague cosmic force, or it could be God, right? But everybody knows that anybody who advocates this stuff, and Nagel does this too, he thinks that the best candidate for such a designer is God, right? So that's something to be aware of in this conversation, all right? And I think ID advocates kind of get themselves in trouble when they try to hedge and say, well, we don't really know, all right? I mean, as a matter of science, we don't know if it's God or not. It's like, well, okay, but everybody kind of knows that that's what you're going towards, right? If you look at the writings of ID advocates, they work in the fields of Christian theology and apologetics and that kind of stuff. All right. Okay, so finally, background information is kind of over with. Let's get into Nagel's dilemma. All right. So what is he up to in this article that I had you read? Right. So here's the deal. He puts forward a kind of dilemma for people who would restrict the teaching of intelligent design in public schools. He says, look, either one admits that the intervention of a designer is possible or one does not. Okay, so look, there's no middle ground there. You either think it's possible or you don't. Okay, there's no third option, so that's obviously true. Okay, there's no, you're either gonna admit this is possible or not, right? That's that. Now, the second part says if one does, then one is free to argue that there is scientific evidence against design. Right? Yeah, this is what Darwin did, right? But not free to argue that it is impossible to furnish scientific evidence in favor of a design. Okay? So both must do science. So if you're going to be giving evidence in favor of a design, you can be doing science on Nagel's view. Okay? You can be doing science. All right, so then the third part is that if one does not, then one must explain why that belief is more scientific than the belief that a designer is possible. And Nagel, I mean, this is implicit in his paper. He doesn't exactly say this. He just kind of expects the reader to find this obvious. And so I want to make that obvious to you, if you didn't realize what he was up to here, That's an impossible task, all right? No one can do a complete search of all reality and then determine there's no God, okay? That's just not something anybody can do. Now, you might have philosophical reasons for thinking that God does not exist, but those go beyond the scientific enterprise, okay? You're gonna get into like an argument from evil, right? So, hey, if God exists and there's all this terrible suffering in the world, you know, come on. Like, how could God exist, right? That's going to be an argument that goes beyond science, right? Science is not something that's going to be able to resolve the existence of God. Okay, that's one thing that he thinks here, all right? Okay, now you might think that there's a reply to the second horn of the dilemma here, and that's the advocates of methodological naturalism. Remember, that just says, hey, look, you can't admit supernatural causation into science, right? I mean, once you start doing that, you know, you can just admit all kinds of silly stuff, right? You got sick because, you know, demon possession, right? Or, you know, depression shouldn't be treated with medication, rather it should be treated with prayer. And, you know, I mean, and look, that's not good, right? So we don't want to go this way, right? But Nagel has a reply to this worry. He says, look, while God himself, you know, cannot be subject to scientific scrutiny, right? I mean, let's just admit that, okay? This does not imply that there cannot be scientific evidence for or against God's actions in nature. All right, so, you know, maybe we can't observe God. That's fair enough, but maybe we could observe, like, some of his handiwork or his fingerprints, right? You know, you can tell, I mean, look, right? When the three bears came back to their home, they saw that somebody was in their house, right? Somebody had eaten the porridge, they had seen, right, that somebody was sleeping in their beds and all this kind of stuff, right? You might think that, you know, there's no reason why God could not, right, causally intervene in the world and arrange things certain ways such that you could present, like, well, look, something here happened, right? Something here was designed. How he did it, I don't know, okay, but it happened. Okay, that's the point that Nagel wants to make, right? So think about that. You know, I don't know. You know, you might think that he's on to something here, or think of some objections. I don't have any spelled out for you right now, right? Because I just want to talk about the upshot, right? What Nagel is basically trying to get at here is that defining science in such a way that ID advocates can neither argue for their position nor dispute the deliverance of the scientific establishment violates religious neutrality. Right, so Nagel is actually also a professor of legal philosophy, and he is well versed in constitutional law, and he thinks that this sort of policy, right, the sort of policy that's being put forward, like in the Kitzmiller versus Dover case, actually ends up violating religious neutrality. Right, it goes too far. Right, so that's what he's up to. All right, so, oh yes, this is my typesetting problem here. Let's see. Oh, how did I want to do this? This didn't work out the way I wanted it to. Let's just delete this part. Okay, so do you agree that something illiberal is happening here? And why or why not? Do you think something unfair is going on? Do you think that Nagel's on to something, right? That somehow the case against teaching intelligent design is just being unfair, right? It's violating norms of intellectual inquiry and also religious neutrality, right? That's kind of what I want you to talk about, right? And so, you know, when I formulate the discussion question, I'll be more specific, okay? All right, let's take a look at the case against teaching ID. Now, this comes from an article that directly responds to Nagel. All right, and you know, I think this is a good little paper because, first of all, it's short, right? It's always nice to read short papers, and it kind of gets into, you know, it summarizes his argument nicely and maybe helps you understand how you could formulate an objection to it. So the reason I didn't give objections up here is because we're saving them, right? Here they are, okay? So what is it that what's the main problem with Nagel's argument? All right, so you might think, well, you know, it seems okay, right? I don't know, I couldn't think of an objection, but you might think that it proves too much. It's a bit too powerful, all right? And they think that what Nagel, he doesn't actually go where his argument can ultimately take him. He actually stops kind of short and just says, well, here's what we need. Here's what I'm going to recommend. Just a non-committal discussion of ID, and we'll do that for the purpose of providing a better understanding of the evidence, for and against evolutionary theory. All right, so basically, his purpose here is to actually kind of help evolutionary theory out, right? He wants you to kind of give a better education by considering the alternative hypothesis and why people think it, and then you could kind of do your science education and show how you could respond to that argument, and then you could deepen the students' understandings of evolutionary theory. That's what he is wanting to do. And the reason he's doing this is that he wants to abide by what's called the Lemon test in constitutional law, right? So you can read about this case on Wikipedia. It's a nice little entry here. It's a famous kind of landmark case that helps us understand how the Establishment Clause in the United States Constitution should be applied. All right, so it has three different conditions here for a law on the books, right? The law has got to have a secular legislative purpose. Okay, so it can't be aimed at, forwarding a religious purpose. Okay, that seems like a good idea. And then the effect of the law must not advance nor inhibit religion. Okay, now you might think that might be a little too strong. You might be wondering, well, what does it mean to advance religion? Is it to make religion look good, look bad? I mean, so there's this issue. And then we want to also avoid excessive government entanglement with religion. Okay, so those are the three things that you got to abide by if you're going to pass the Lemon test. And so what Nagel's recommendation, what he's giving, is intended to do that. Okay, but the case against him says, well, actually, you have to go further, right? You have to go further, and now you're going to run into problems with these three conditions, right? That's the dialectic, right? So what the argument actually recommends, according to these authors, Akin and the other, I'll say Akin et al., is that what it recommends is actually an unconstitutional equal time policy, right, that presents the actual evidence for ID, if there is any, or any other controversial metaphysical position in an unbiased way. All right, so Nagel tries to get out of this problem by saying, well, look, you could just teach evolution as good science and ID as bad science, and that way you can forward, right, the purpose here of this non-committal discussion of enhancing our education of evolutionary theory, right? But these guys don't think it's going to work, right? They don't think that's going to work because pro-ID science teachers actually think their view is based on good science, while evolution is based on bad science, right? And the teachers are going to be free to advocate that case in the classroom given Nagel's argument, right? And there are pro-ID teachers in the public schools. They've been subject of lawsuits, all right? And so what ends up happening here is that basically what happens is that Nagel's argument gets you in trouble with the three conditions, right? To illustrate why they think this is the case, all right, they run a parody of his argument. All right, so here's the parody, right? They take the same premises and they say this: either one admits that Berkeleyan idealism is possible or not. All right, so you probably have no idea what I'm talking about here. So let me just give you a link to this Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy about Berkeley, and let's zoom in on this to help you understand. Whoa, what happened here? Oh my gosh. There we go. I don't understand how things work. But anyway, what is it? What is idealism? All right. Basically, what idealism is that ordinary objects, physical objects that you come into contact with, actually aren't real, right? They're actually collections of ideas in your mind, right? So this coffee cup that I got in my hand right now, right, is just kind of a figment of my imagination. It's the sense data. You might think, well, I can sense it; it's all there. But all that stuff is just impressed upon the mind, right? So perception is reality. Okay, it's one of these weird philosophy views that undergraduates hate whenever they take a philosophy course, right? What you're perceiving just is reality. There's nothing beyond that. So there's no material world, right? All there is kind of the immaterial mental content that we have, right? All right, so there's no material substances, right? And the mental content we have is actually caused by God on Berkeley's view, right? Did I say Berkeley earlier? Yeah, you pronounce this Berkeleyan idealism. Okay, so anyway, the idea, so there's no material objects on this view, all right? So look, you either admit that's possible or you don't. All right? Okay, so maybe the world's like that. All right, you might, okay, so maybe, or you say, no, it can't be like that at all. All right, so suppose that you think it is possible that that's the case, right? Then one is free to argue that there's scientific evidence against idealism, but not free to argue that it's impossible to furnish scientific evidence in favor. Okay, so both advocates of idealism and opponents of it can be doing some science, okay? Or if you don't think it's possible, then you got to explain why your belief is more scientific than the belief that idealism is possible. And that's impossible because no one can do a complete search of all reality, okay? So the upshot then is that Newtonian physics is what you learn in high school, okay? Which assumes that there is a material world independent of our minds is just disguised theology, right? And that's just kind of absurd. Like, no, we're still going to learn Newtonian physics, all right? We don't need to have some kind of non-committal discussion about this. We certainly don't have to have an equal time for Berkeleyan idealism alongside Newtonian physics. That's just ridiculous, right? So we can actually then, by parity of reasoning, say the same thing about intelligent design, right? Evolution just can be taught without regard to any of this stuff, right? And there's nothing controversial about it. All right, so that's how they reply to Nagel. They think that he goes too far, right? And but you might object here. You know, is it possible? You could just say, look, it's not possible to scientifically test whether idealism is true, while it is possible to test whether some kind of intervention has happened. All right, so you might think that there's a difference. Okay, it's possible to test whether or not design has happened, but it's not possible to test whether idealism is true. That's just some weird metaphysical view, right? And you have to give a philosophical argument for it. So a question I leave you with, you know, does Nagel's case just prove too much? And what do you think? Why or why not, right? Do you think this objection is a good one? Or do you think that it's answerable? All right, so that is the lesson for today. I hope that you enjoyed this class. You know, I enjoyed making these lectures and kind of talking to you over, you know, the video here at YouTube. It's weird not to see your faces, of course, but I have enjoyed reading your responses. A lot of you have put together, you know, a lot of good effort. And so, you know, I look forward to this discussion. Again, if you have questions, feel free to email me, and I will talk to you later.